And we're now recording. I'd like to introduce Al Scott from the parish, who himself has been working at the Naval Postgraduate School and was our speaker last month about the graduate international student program. And he will be introducing our speaker today. Al?
Thank you, Lee. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aleksandar Matovski. Alex is an assistant professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval Postgraduate School, as well as an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Alex's research focuses on the dynamics of regime legitimization, popular opinion, political violence, and protest in autocracies, with a regional emphasis on Europe and the former Soviet Union. He earned his PhD in government from Cornell University, an MA in war studies from King's College London, and a BA in law from St. Cyril and Methodius University, Skopje, North Macedonia, excuse me. Prior to his academic career, Alex was a national security advisor in the government of North Macedonia and political and military advisor in the North Macedonian Ministry of Defense, focusing on foreign affairs and security reforms and NATO and European Union integration. And I think you can all agree with me with Alex's academic credentials and background. He's a phenomenal individual to address the topic that we have today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and opportunity to meet people in the church and also the community. So I'm a recent kind of employee, if you like, at MPS, and recently moved to the area. In this stunted environment we're in, it's been hard to meet people. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak on these topics in a more informal setting than the school. So what I prepared really is kind of a bit of a presentation. So I'll try to do a bit of shock and awe, if you like, with terms of some figures, numbers, and pictures, and speak for about 30 minutes approximately, based on how quickly I go over the slides, to introduce the topic, and then we maybe turn to discussion. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of start sharing my screen here. So let me just blow this up and then make sure that everybody can see this. So just making sure, can everybody see okay the slides? Okay, so yes, again, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak to you on these topics. It's something I kind of deal with on a daily basis in research. So what I'll try to do is give a broad brush introduction to some of the key drivers of Russia's behavior in recent years. It's the regime and its ruler in particular. I kind of added Putinism to the topic that was advertised here, because I consider that's like the core of the issue. So just in a way of like introduction, I'll start with a disclaimer. What I say does not reflect the views of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the Navy and MPS, for who I work for. It's my own research on these topics. And what I'll do, I'll throw a lot of data and graphs, as I mentioned at you. So if you want to follow up on some of that, I'll give you some of the sources where this is coming from, some of the published research and the forthcoming research. It really pulls from two sources. There's an edited volume that recently came out in 2020 that compares Russia and China. And I have a chapter there that looks in the logic of Vladimir Putin's popular appeal in Russia. So that's one source where I'm drawing a lot of this research from. And the second one is a forthcoming book that I will have published. It's forthcoming in the fall, if everything goes well in the pandemic environment. It's titled Popular Dictatorships. It looks at the Putinist template expanded to other countries beyond this, kind of similar types of autocracies. So I just kind of wanted to raise these two sources if this is a interesting enough topic to just keep on reading on it, and if it's captivating enough for that. But without much ado, it's always good to start with Churchill on Russia. So the Churchill's famous dictum was that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. When you try to understand its behavior, and it applies quite well recently. A lot of what Russia has been doing is quite enigmatic from many points of view. You have aggressive behavior across the board. You have the wars in Ukraine and Syria. You have mischief all over the place in Libya and across the world. So a lot of people ask, well, what's going on? And is the Cold War back? What is driving this? And what comes out as key, and in particular from my point of view and research, is the Putin regime itself, basically. How it stays in power at home in particular. So this is not a traditional topic that's researched and viewed by people as crucial for a country's behavior. It's usually the interests of the country more broadly rather than a regime itself. But here we're dealing with regime most of all. And that's a key way how Russia is different maybe from China as the other rising adversary, if you like. So to talk about the puzzle, I'm going to look at the puzzle within the puzzle, actually, as a starting point. The key puzzle in Russia is the discrepancy between the support for the regime for most of the years of Putinism and how life looks in Russia here. So I'll just start with 5 basic facts on life in Russia that came in a study that came out in 2013. So this is before Russia's economy took the current dip and is in the doldrums right now. So one of the peaks of economic rise in Putin's reign before the war in Ukraine here. So just a few facts here. So in 2013, the annual cost of bribery in Russia is $300 billion US, which is more than the entire GDP of Denmark, just to give you a scale of that. By some estimates, the scale of corruption in Russia reaches to a whopping 40% of its economy. So 40% of the economy is corrupt in some ways or the other. This is a tremendous drag, if you might imagine, on the economy, on free enterprise, those things that kind of move things forward in an economic sense. The same thing creates one of the worst inequalities globally. So just, it's a shocking figure. Again, in 2013, when things were better, about 35% of Russia's wealth is held by just about 100 people. Just how concentrated this wealth is. So Russia's wealth is literally plundered by regime-connected elites there. This is not like people who have succeeded by pulling themselves by their bootstraps, but these are cronies of the regime in effect. In the meantime, the population is not doing as great as a lot of people might imagine. So population standards in Russia lag behind its kind of close competitors. So these are the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China are usually put in that category. So median wealth in Russia at that time was about $870, whereas it was about 1,000 in India, 5,000 in Brazil, and 8,000 in China. So Russia is really lagging behind these. If you dig deeper, the quality of life in Russia is horrific in some ways. You have African level life expectancy. So life expectancy of a 15-year-old male in Russia is 3 years shorter than in Haiti, which is one of the kind of worst performers in this regard. So quality of life, healthcare, education has been at African levels in these countries. And all of this is before the annexation and crippling Western sanctions. So kind of in the good times, if you like, in Russia. And after, before the Kremlin cronies captured more of Russia's economy. So one of the more recent figures in 15, you have another shocking number. So Russia's offshore wealth is 75% of GDP. So 75% of Russia's money is actually offshore in somebody's bank account. So these are shocking numbers. And these are issues that Russia's, in Putin's corruption-propped system cannot resolve. In essence. So that's one part of the puzzle. The second part of the puzzle is Vladimir Putin's popularity. So this graph shows the popular approval ratings of Putin since 1999 to 2020 on a scale of 0 to 100. A couple of things come to mind. First, he was an instant star. So his popularity shoots up from basically 0 to over 80% in the wake of the First Chechen War, which was this staged adventure to recapture a rest of tiny province in Russia, which really made him a national hero. And then it never drops below 60% until now, basically, until last year or something. I'll come back in a moment. It reaches over 80% after the Crimea annexation and a couple of other points. And it's 75% on average. So just as a reference point, US presidents average around 51% in terms of kind of their popularity ratings over time. So that's like 25% lower than Putin's ratings. So this popularity is crucial for the regime stability. So it kind of gives the regime a super majority that grants domination over institutions and elites. Nobody can touch Putin because he's like the holy man that everybody supports. So the key paradox of Putinism is, how can a regime that's so corrupt be so popular at the same time?
It's just like Trump, same thing.
I'm sorry, come again? Okay, so just, this kind of idea is this paradox is crucial to Putinism. And then the key response, and it's a myth, is that Putin's popularity is not real, but fake. In essence, that people living in this stunted and authoritarian environment basically falsely profess their love for the leader. But actually, this is not true, and there's a couple of ways to look at it. The most direct one is actually, there is a survey technique to show how much people are lying to you in surveys. It's kind of a convoluted technique to explain how it works, but trust me here, I'll just kind of show you the outcome. So it's called a list experiment. It estimates the percentage of people who falsify their responses. What's their true response relative to what they say in direct questions. So here you have the list experiment in blue versus direct question. And the list experiment comes with this error bar you see there because it's an estimate how much they're lying. It's not a precise calculation. And the error bar there, that little black bar, overlaps the direct question here. So you have, this is self-reported vote for Putin versus estimated real vote for Putin. And these types of studies have been done over the year and show that only about 6 to 9% falsely report they vote or approve for Putin, which is not significant when you look at the scale of his ratings. His ratings range between 60 and 90%. Take away 9% from that and it doesn't matter, basically. So it's really tiny to compare there. But there are also more direct ways to look at this. And I'll come through the second myth, an idea, again, which contradicts what I showed before, but this idea that Putin's popular because people think he brought prosperity or is effectively solving Russia's problem. To show you this, there's this question, like, or set of questions asking Russians how much Putin has achieved, and this was asked in 2012 specifically, again in the good times, in his time in office. So they go through 8 functional areas, starting from foreign affairs, the global influence of Russia, to personal freedom. How much have things changed? How much they have increased, decreased, or haven't changed at all? So global influence of Russia, about 59% think Putin improved things. So that's a positive. But then everything else is pretty bad, actually. So political stability in Russia, less than 50% of Russians tell you Putin improved things, which is horrific. In the 90s, Russia was in chaos. Stability in the North Caucasus, where Chechnya is, which is his trading kind of main kind of trademark for popularity, less than 50% say it improved under him. Income inequality, over 70% say it gotten worse, increased under his rule. Corruption of state officials, over 50% say it's worse, or over 80% it's the same. Standard of living, about 33% say it increased under him. Responsiveness of the state, same thing, and personal freedom even worse. So at the same time, 70% of these same people say they would vote for Putin. So you have this interesting disconnect. First of all, people are obviously not lying to you, because if they lie, they support Putin, they'll also lie that everything's great under his reign, right? And you see this very low marks for his popularity. So there's got to be something else propping up Putinism in this background. And that's key for the aggressiveness, as I'll show in a minute. So what drives Putin's popular appeal? It's crucial to see what happened in the 90s before Putin. The roots of his this performance approval discrepancy lie there. So Russia in the 90s was in total chaos, and people were tremendously traumatized, people who lived through this. Effectively, Russia is shown in the pictures. You have the picture from the war in Chechnya on the right, and then the economic collapse on the left. Effectively lived through the largest peacetime decline in history in this period. So just to show you, one graph is particularly striking, is this Russia's socioeconomic collapse in this period. So this graph shows years after crisis on this horizontal scale, and then how much the economy dropped. Basically, how much it went under that dashed black line is your indicator of crisis. So to understand the shock to the system, it's good to compare it to the Great Depression of the 30s to see how much deeper the depression was. So during the depression of the 30s, the German economy, which collapsed and resulted with Nazism, has this much of a collapse. This is the line, how much it went under the kind of the starting point, and then how quickly it recovered. So it falls by about 20%. So like German economy loses 20% of its of GDP essentially, and returns in pre-depression kind of levels in 8 years. And this is the trauma that produces Nazism in Germany. In comparison, the Russian economy looks like this in the 90s. So it declines by 42%. This is whopping 42% decline, and takes 17 years to come back to pre-depression levels. So, I mean, Russia, in other words, experiences economic collapse at least twice as large and lasting twice as long than what produced the Hitler regime in Germany. Just to kind of give you an idea of the scale of this. Like the extent of human suffering, you can only compare it to kind of active warfare, basically, what happened there. Just living in Russia in this period, for those who were there, was this trauma that you can only compare to active warfare. And Putinism is a consequence of that. And let me show you, if there's one graph to show you how Russian opinion works, it's this one that explains the last 30 years. So this one actually asks the question of kind of popular demand for strong armed rule. You have three responses down there in colors. So first response is a straight out authoritarian response. Our people always need a strong hand, in red. The second in pink is we need it now. It's kind of this contingent authoritarianism. We're in trouble now. We need a strong leader. Maybe later we become democratic. And blue is we should never put power in the hands of one person, which is the straight out liberal response. And this is like the most shocking kind of graph about how things change in Russia. So look at 1989, November 1989. This is the month when the Berlin Wall falls, the end of the Cold War. And look at where the numbers are at the beginning. So a solid 45% of the Russian population gives you the straight out liberal response after 71 years of the most brutal dictatorship in history and all the brainwashing and propaganda that came with it. They want to have a liberal country. You have just 25 who give you the straight out authoritarian, and another 15 give you the contingent authoritarian response. Well, after that, you hit the crisis. So I put these lines for the main events in the crisis: the Soviet collapse, the constitutional crises of 93, financial crisis 94, the first Chechen war, when it looked like Russia is just going to go down the drain, basically. And look what happens with the attitudes. They start flipping. So now you have a majority of 32% want a straight out authoritarianism, and another 26 want a contingent one, and liberal responses down to 28%. And over time, you have the second kind of stage of the Russian collapse in the late 90s, and you have the trend completely flip. And it doesn't change much under Putinism. Kind of the whole mentality was set up before Putin, before actually even anybody knew who Putin was. He was an unknown official early in his tenure. So like 5 years before anybody knew who Putin was, you had the demand for somebody like Putin out there, a kind of a strong arm ruler who's going to take care of us and prevent another catastrophic collapse there, basically. So kind of, it's kind of a very shocking transition in public opinion preceding Putinism here. Another thing, it shows you that Russians are not like, predisposed mentally in some way to be authoritarian. Russians wanted to be democratic. They just were shocked by the failure of that in the 90s, and they just don't want to go back to that trauma again. And it shows you this, the support for Putinism is not an artifact of propaganda, because it was there before there was any Putinist propaganda, basically. This kind of flip of public opinion. It's actually the opposite. Propaganda plays on this sentiment rather than creating it in a way. So that's kind of a key thing to keep in mind. So in a way, Putinism is a product of popular demand for a strong man who will impose and maintain order in Russia to avoid another catastrophic decline before. So it's kind of crucial to think about how Russians think differently about approving their leaders here. How does Russian popular opinion differ from what we used to in the West? So in the West, the primary driver of how you vote essentially is this idea, what have you done for me lately? Kind of economic voting rationale. What has the leadership or done to improve the country, right? It's kind of the logic of kind of popular feedback for good performance. In the other hand, in Russia, voting logic is, are things going to be worse if we vote out the incumbent out of office? It's going to look backwards. All right, so they're not, the incumbent can do a lot of bad stuff, but if they're still fearful of the alternatives, they'll stick with the incumbent, basically. And that's what's sustaining Putinism here. It's like this perfect slogan in one of the rallies for Putin. It says, if not Putin, then who? That's how people think. People traumatized by the 90s in Russia think about this. So there are some key kind of downstream effect, if you like, of this type of thinking on regime support. And this is another kind of key illustration of how Putin's approval works. So this is a question is, why do you support Putin? Why do you trust Putin, basically? There are these three reasons for it. In blue, it's because people are convinced that Putin successfully tackles the country's problems, which is the way we vote in the West, basically. And it's interesting that just about less than 30% on average have this performance, give him this performance vote. They vote, just 30% of Russians vote for Putin because they think he's improving the situation in the country. Another more than 30 to 40% say that they hope that he's going to deal with the problems in the future. And another 30 to 40% say because there's nobody else to vote for. So the reason is about 70% of Russians vote for Putin because they either fear the alternative or they hope, something will change. It's kind of hope and fear rather than actual performance in this situation that's driving Putin's support. And here is the centrality here is this strongman appeal of Putin. As somebody who guarantees that things are not going to fall back to what Russia was in the 90s. I'll just show this through slogans and posters for Putin's campaigns since his kind of first coming into office. So one of the most famous slogans for Putin was raising Russia from his knees. It was 2004 and 2000 election and 2008 election slogan. There's another one on this poster in 2012, a strong leader for a great country. Is another way they frame this. Strong president, strong Russia. This is the last election in 2018. And my personal favorite, this is a statement by the Speaker of Parliament in Russia. It says, while Putin's there, so is Russia. Once Putin's gone, so is Russia, basically. That's the mentality. All right, this idea that if this strongman leader is replaced, we're going down the drain. It's the end of the world, basically. That's what they've conditioned the population to think about, and that's what the population conditioned itself given that trauma. Well, the key thing is like how this appeal works drives aggression. It's kind of maybe some of the major takeaways. So regimes that are justified on a promise to restore stability and greatness are fairly fragile, even though they are, they have high support. They become redundant in the population's point of view, both if they succeed in their mission of restoring stability, because if you succeed, why do we need you anymore as a strongman? We can fall back to being the Democrats. And if they fail in their mission. So basically they have to juggle two incompatible goals. They must, in essence, sustain or even manufacture the crises and threats that justify their rules. So Russians have to stay scared of going back to the 90s to support Putinism with all its problems in the background, to still think that they're better off, even in their pretty miserable conditions now, than abandoning this strongman regime. And while they're manufacturing this crisis and sustaining it, also to appear to be successful in addressing the crisis. It's kind of a tightrope act for these folks. And they can never show weakness in this end of war, because that's the only thing they got. Like, you saw how horrible those actual performance figures are there. So they got to create boogies basically all the time. And that brings me to conflict and then Putin's popular support. So why are they aggressive? They've become aggressive, actually, the more they've been challenged in recent years. So this is Vladimir Putin's support, approval and disapproval now. So blue is approval, red is disapproval, to just show you this kind of mirror image attitudes across the population. And what I want to show you is an analysis of the peaks and troughs in disapproval reading. So some of the peaks are come after the Chechnya invasion. So that's the initial explosion of support for Putin. Next one is the war with Georgia in 2008. Next one is the annexation of Crimea. So you notice the peaks tend to be worse. When people are frightened, Russia's, foreigners are out there to get us, we got to fight back. The troughs, on the other hand, are protests against domestic kind of bad economic conditions. So 2005 is one. Another one is a protest wave after Putin he says, I'm going to come back to power after his 2 terms in office. He's going to come in for a third one. And this protest against corruption of the regime. And more recently, there was this extension of pension age, which really angered a lot of Russians. And you see how the support declines again. So peaks are wars, troughs are protests. And so the threat, if you kind of see there how they kind of switch, the threat for declining popularity, the red disapproval rating meeting the approval rating, comes from protests, and it's fixed by wars, basically. So like one of the interpretations for the Crimea annexation is it's a diversionary conflict. The regime needed it to renew itself so it can stay in power, basically, in this period. And
Makes sense.
for sure. And so basically kind of the last thing I wanted to leave you with here is another way to ask the same question, which is, for this type of regime, they're always on the lookout for what the future is. Like if the leader starts looking weak, things are kind of falling apart and you might have a run on the bank type of collapse. Even with high popularity, they just go down very quickly sometimes. So this question is crucial and it's predictive, I argue. So it asks basically, do you want to see Putin as president after the end of the current term?
Yeah.
So he's going through his, what is it now?
Blue line.
Fourth term. And there's going to be elections in 2024, maybe earlier, to extend Putin's term for another, this is going to be what, 5th term? I'm losing count. So this question, you have a couple of responses. So in blue, Putin to stay on as president. In red, Putin not to continue as president. So this series started low points of support for Putin's regime. In 2012, 2013, when he was facing protests against his corruption and this kind of authoritarianism of the regime. And look at where the trends were going. So the Reds, people who said we want Putin to be out, or outnumbering, there were over 40%, 40%, 45% of Russians said we want Putin to be out. And, about 35% said, let's have him stick around. And then you have the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass, and look at what happens. They flipped the series. Everybody said, oh, we need this, he's a great hero, kind of restoring Russia's greatness. We have all these enemies around. We need somebody like Putin. It really kind of saves Putinism for a bunch of 3 or 4 years. It extends the lease of life. He wins another term in office in 18. And then people start flipping back, especially after another shock when he cuts down their pension age, extends the pension age requirements. People get angry and this starts flipping again. And here's where we are. So there was a recent reset of presidential term limits. He said, I'm going to stay forever. And this thing is starting to flip again. So now the number desiring Putin to leave versus stay is narrowing, and those wanting him to leave are increasing in number. So question is, this is quite unstable. At some point, they'll need another distraction. And we're facing that potential in the coming years. There'll be parliamentary elections this year and presidential elections in 2024. And, will they start another war, in other words, to extend their lease in life here? So Russia, the way Russia is different from China as a competitor is China is a rising power. They're self-assured. On the wrong run, they're rising economically. They think they're overtaking us. Russia is a declining country with all those economic numbers you're seeing there, with a regime that's threatened. So I argue Russia is more similar in its behavioral pattern to North Korea than to China. It's a kind of a rogue state more than a peer competitor in this regard. Which is a very disquieting thought. Like, look at tiny North Korea with its, impoverished country with all its resources, how much damage it could do. Imagine Russia with its arsenal, how much troublesome that can be in kind of handling things in the world affairs. So I'm going to close with that disquieting thought and then really kind of maybe keep talking in Q&A on these topics. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alex. If someone has a question, please unmute yourself and we'll try to recognize you. And if I fail to recognize you, then just kind of holler.
Maybe I should stop sharing as well so we can see each other more.
Hello, can you hear me?
Here we have someone, Alex.
My name is John, and the question
Nice to meet
is for Aleksandar, and that was very interesting. I'd like to know a little bit more about the Levanda Institute and your relationship with them, since you seem to rely very heavily on statistics coming from them.
Right.
Portrayal of those statistics. So some of those I thought were very interesting, and some I thought were a bit skewed.
Right.
On that, please.
No, sure, absolutely. And you can take me back to whichever slide you thought it was skewed, and maybe we'll talk about it. So yeah, Levada Center is this independent polling center that existed in Russia. It was formed actually by an anti-Soviet dissident, Yuri Levada, at the end of the communist period. So they've been known to be dissidents, basically. So currently they're being labeled by the regime as so-called foreign agents, and they've been persecuted. So they tried to shut down the center in 2003, and they tried to shut them down more recently. I think it was 12 or 13 when they labeled them as foreign agents. So they've been constantly under pressure by the regime because the regime doesn't like a lot of the numbers they're publishing there. Like, people are seeing maybe the approval is sliding, and as you might imagine, Mr. Putin doesn't like to see that. So there's a lot of kind of studies in their integrity, if you like, whether they're kind of messing with the numbers, if you like, and they're well regarded. The reason why the Kremlin doesn't shut them down is they want an objective outside outfit to look at public opinion data, not just their own in-house pollsters, as a way to kind of check against biases so they don't grow overconfident. They know Levada is quite competent, the center, and they just let them be so they can draw on their data and kind of fine tune their message and propaganda and things like that. So that's why people are regarding them well. There are a couple of other actually state-owned, kind of Kremlin-controlled pollsters. And another way to check on Levada is actually you see how much their findings agree with the state pollsters. And they've been very closely in sync actually for the last 20 years. So yeah, Levada, people have cut this so many ways, and Levada is basically legitimate is my takeaway. But I can speak to kind of specific data if you're interested in that.
I think time will allow us to do that. But thank you very much for the background on Levada, and I found your discussion to be very insightful and helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad it helps.
If you don't have a screen showing but have a question, you can send me a message in chat and we'll call on you. Spence, you had a question.
Well, I just have some insights, I think. I'm the one that has a Russian daughter. And I also have another close friend who stayed with us for several times, a month at a time, leading Russian delegations of small businessmen and women. It's interesting because they both are contemporaries. And my daughter is completely cognizant of how corrupt Putin is. And the other person is an intelligent person, but she has family in Russia. She goes back. And when you ask her, what do you think of Putin? She will say, he loves his country. And she can't see the negatives. So I don't know the difference, but I hear all of the terrible tales about having to go to the hospital in Russia, and you have to have your parents bring food in because either they don't feed you or the food is so terrible you can't eat it. And so one person very familiar with it has a positive attitude, and the other one sees through it. And so I know you can't interpret that. I just think it's interesting and it's personal to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting, something I observe in public opinion. So like, these are kind of more sterile public opinion data. You just see numbers, but like a lot of times you do research through focus groups when you interview people, when they kind of start talking to you and you see the colors, if you like, behind the numbers. And it's interesting kind of how people approach it. I mean, what you said, that supportive person is someone I encounter a lot. I would say maybe 30% of the people respond like that. Putin is a patriot, don't kind of talk bad about him and so on. They're ready to ignore the bad side of things because they emphasize that kind of restoration of Russia, the stabilizing role and so on. I call it the Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome is like when you get, a bunch of hostages get captured by a terrorist. They put a gun in their head, and over time they become friends, even despite the kind of the terroristic relationship there. You kind of rationalize when you know you don't have an exit or you think you don't have an exit from a situation. People have this natural tendency to make kind of life mentally easier for them by rationalizing the situation as a normal one. So basically, even glorifying your captor in some ways as a good person or as a great person even. So I mean, personally, I call it the Stockholm Syndrome for a lot of those people. Some of the people are actually benefiting. So like, when you look at some of the regime elites, they have been elevated by Putin. They're making a lot of money, much more than in progressing in their career. So there's like a kind of an economic incentive for some of those people. So there's some, differences for why they do that. Other people have been pulled out on, I don't know, for instance, from the provinces and brought to Moscow by the Putinist regime. So they're thankful for that opportunity. So you have different reasons for it. But for people who don't have a kind of a skin in the game type of benefit, it's this, I call it the Stockholm Syndrome, really, in a lot of ways. That kind of answers your question, but that's how I kind of perceive it most of the time.
Thank you.
Alex, we have a question on the chat. How has Putin fared under COVID? What has public reaction been to the government's handling of the pandemic in Russia?
Thank you very much. That's kind of a very pertinent question now. They've fared horribly. So their excess death numbers, like this grim figure that we're seeing in every country in the world today, are much worse than ours, actually. In the Western world, the US has been seen as not doing great, to put it mildly, with COVID. Russia is worse than that. To some extent, people there don't kind of maybe fully blame it on the regime, but it's been horrible in terms of the actual impact. So they're doing bad. Even with vaccines, they've one of the producers of the vaccinations, like they have their own vaccine now. Only 40% of Russians want to take that vaccine. Even though they're selling it as a great vaccine abroad, their own people don't trust it, basically. So that's another indicator of how distrustful, like they're like hostages. Even, both those who are kind of still for the regime, and those who just say we got to stick with them so we don't collapse. They're like hostages in this situation. They have this tremendous dislike of the regime while also still supporting it. A very precarious situation is continued on the COVID. Economically, they've been hit. It's pretty bad. Government, they had this horrible, as I kind of illustrated earlier, their health system is horrible. So you can just imagine how that looks on a day-to-day level. Doctors like have been committing suicide on mass level in Russia, just another grim figure, an indicator, because they couldn't cope and they were under pressure to lie about the numbers of people hospitalized, people who have passed away and so on. So another hit. Luckily for Putin, interestingly, the COVID situation, keeping people at home may have shrinked the protests a little bit. So the fact that people are afraid to go out and together and protest has to some degree maybe helped the regime. But I wonder what's going to happen when, finally we're kind of free and things open up, whether this pent up resentment is going to blow up more. So they might actually, because of the fear of that, they're scheduling elections earlier. So we might see an election for Putin being scheduled earlier. There's going to be one in the fall for the parliament elections, out of fear that what the reaction is going to be when they open up. But no, they're doing horribly in this regard, despite the vaccines and all that.
Additional questions? Ed, you need to unmute yourself.
Aleksandar, I'm married to a Russian lady who currently lives in St. Petersburg. I talk with her a couple of times a week on WhatsApp and have had conversations while she was on buses, even on the subway in St. Petersburg. Interestingly, in the last year, I've never seen one time one single person in St. Petersburg under those WhatsApp's video without a mask.
Right.
My wife is the daughter of a pediatrician, and she believes that everything is moving very well from a COVID standpoint. She has 5 children there. They're of course not children at this point, they're older. But I just want to comment, I've been to Russia many times, starting in the early 1990s. And after 50 years of Cold War, being raised with the idea of ducking under your desk, and then going to Russia for the first time, I realized that these Russians are essentially the same as us.
Yeah.
That's not true in many other countries in the world, and I've been to 56. So it's interesting to me that the Russian people generally really feel like they're well off. And I've talked to, I don't know if thousands, but certainly hundreds over the time on all levels, farmers to government people. Matter of fact, one of the interesting things is they have more holidays than we do. And so I talked with my wife and she says, well, I can't talk with you tomorrow because I'm going to go blah, 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 because it's another holiday. I said, you just had a holiday 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So anyhow, Putin or the government must be doing something right in terms of holidays. But the last comment that I want to just leave with you is that I'm not really interested in Putin, but the Russian people are wonderful people, and I just want to get that point out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I try to kind of, despite all the bleak stuff that I put up front, I try to push that forward. These are not people who are kind of, programmed to be enemies or programmed to be authoritarians. These are, very similar people to people you meet every day in different countries, including the US, who are just in this under pressure in this difficult environment, have been during the Soviet period and still. In terms of those kind of happiness, putting a happy face sometimes on things, some people might be satisfied. And actually a key difference to understand, and especially in relation to COVID these days, is differences between the capital city and Petersburg as well. So the big cities and the rest of Russia. Big cities are kind of, if you travel to Moscow, Petersburg, they'll look like the Western European countries, capitals when you travel there. Very nice, very modern, very wealthy, you would say in many ways. But if you step down the city limits, you're in Africa, basically, in Russia. So this tremendous, like I talked about inequality, the key difference is regional, really. You step out of, in terms of everything, hospitals, corruption, every possible aspect, you just step out of the capital and you're in Africa, basically, third world country type of setup. And a lot of that distinction is in that sense. Paradoxically and perversely, actually, a lot of times the provinces support Putin more than these capital cities because they fear that even that little they have is going to be lost if the strongman is gone. The people protesting tend to be in the big cities, actually the ones that are supposed to be satisfied, especially the younger folks. The younger folks are the forefront. They really don't like Putinism. One of the key problems of Putinism is that the post-Putin generation has come of age. So he's been in power for 21 years more. So you have people who were born after Putin was president who are coming of age now, who don't remember the 90s, who don't remember the chaos before him, and are not, they're not really someone you can convince things will be worse if he's gone. So that's one of the reasons why it's kind of getting stale as a system in a lot of ways. But you're absolutely right. Like, you shouldn't look at Russians as enemies, because these people are just reacting to circumstances you're put in, rather than being intrinsically bad or, something like that. So yeah, thank you for that comment.
I would have to agree with that, because we had these delegations of Russian small businessmen and women come for 3 weeks or a month at a time. And they were universally just like Americans, except struggling with the struggles that they had to confront. Every one of them said that they couldn't get anything done without a bribe.
Yeah.
And they were stunned at the way things work in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are people who want to be Western. Actually, throughout most of Russian history, Russians wanted to kind of Westernize, be modern, and compete with the West. A lot of the fighting that happened was because they thought they were stunted, or they had regimes that wanted to kind of exploit that. They're like, from all the big competitors, they're far more pro-Western than anybody else you could find there.
We're drawing to a close, but I do see 2 more questions which we will take. First, Charles Greenleaf, and then second, Tim Knapp, and then we will close the questions. Charles, you'll need to unmute.
Thank you for the opportunity. The description you've given us of Putin as a leader, political leader over a long period of time, is really quite thorough. And what I know of Navalny seems like a real opposite person in terms of his political thinking. But I'm wondering, how does Putin see Navalny as a threat to the point that his life has been trying to be taken several times?
Yeah, thank you. Should we collect the other question and maybe respond to both, or?
No, why don't we take this one, because I'm not sure that Tim's question will have anything to do with Navalny.
Okay, sure. So Navalny, just for context, he's this opposition leader that was almost poisoned in the summer, survived a chemical weapon attack from a chemical weapon that's like the cutting edge nerve agents from which you don't survive in general. So miraculously survives. He's shepherded to basically to Germany, where they kind of cure him. And then he makes this crazy brave act of go back to Russia despite the fact, and try to oppose Putin more, and now is in prison. So, this has been the one of the key, most effective opposition challengers in recent years, Navalny. And he's an interesting, colorful character. As you I presume you hinted at his different kind of positions he takes. So this is not your classical liberal oppositionist who says we wanted to have democracy. He has had quite nationalist sentiments there. He was kind of anti-immigration, anti-minority in some of his remarks previously. So he kind of posed as nationalist before. I mean, in terms of the way he's kind of structuring his attack on Putin, he's been extremely effective. So Russians don't like the key issue with, a lot of people say if Putin's gone, Russia's going to go great. Actually, there is the sentiments are the same. The Russians still want, and even more in some degrees, a strongman who's going to fix the country. Mm-hmm. They want to kick Putin out, not because he's a dictator, but because he's not a good enough dictator, basically. So that's one of the perverse things. So the idea was we want a dictator to put all these crooks in jail. We didn't want him to become the king of the crooks. That's like the main critique of the opposition in the street is that we want a dictator that's just going to put everybody in jail. So you can't go there and say we want to be Democrats, and you're not going to win effectively. So Navalny has been pretty smart to realize that. So the two areas on which he was attacking Putin was corruption, which is something everybody agrees in the opposition, which is quite fragmented. You have liberals, you have nationalists, you have even former communists opposing Putin for various reasons, but everybody agrees that corruption has to go away. So his primary assault was corruption, and that's where the biggest vulnerability of the regime is. And that's why Putin had to go and take these extreme measures, or at least thought he had to go to extreme length to try to eliminate him. So this guy is extremely smart. He's very opportunistic. He's not going to stay true to any dogma or kind of creed like liberalism to fight Putin. So he's just going to scavenge and take whatever's useful to undermine the regime in a way. So corruption is one area. Also, a lot of nationalists don't like Putin for not being nationalistic enough. So his current core constituency and vulnerability are your nationalists. So he promised he's going to conquer Ukraine when the Ukraine war was going on. He was going to win a war against the West and so on. So these folks are saying, you stop too soon. You're not delivering on that. So his key vulnerability is this group. And Navalny threatened by being a bit nationalistic himself to tap into that as well. So we'll see where this goes. It's unprecedented. This person is in jail. I don't know if he's going to survive the ordeal, given how he was treated before. But, it's really tricky for the Putin regime to kill him as well, because they're going to make a martyr out of him. So he took this tremendous personal gamble, and he's setting a precedent in a country that where, there's no person who you think is clean enough to take over. This guy goes and puts himself in jail effectively to be killed, presumably. And he does something that actually Soviet dissidents, kind of these prisoners of conscience in the 80s and before did. They openly opposed the regime, knowing where that might lead for your personal life and for your family. So it's a tremendous moral challenge at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Why don't we ask Tim to ask his question, and that will be the final question. I know that we could probably go on for quite a bit more time. Unfortunately, unlike live lectures, we can't go up to the lecturer at the end and stand around asking further questions. But Tim Knapp, if you would please ask a question.
Thank you very much. How do you explain Russia or Putin's support of the Assad regime in Syria?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So it's kind of complicated in many ways. So the reason why they're there, it's in essence some extension of the Ukraine movement. It has multiple objectives. It's not one reason why they're there. Is kind of the simplest answer. So one is actually the withdrawal of the U.S. So like the ways Russians operate is they're essentially they enter whenever the U.S. is in withdrawal. They're kind of cautious and rational. They're not going to go on a head-to-head confrontation. They'll know they'll lose. So when the Obama administration at the time decided not to, keep to its own red lines and go against the Syrian regime, they found this opportunity to insert themselves in the region and exert influence from there. Another thing they've done through Syria is they have actually conducted a genocidal campaign there. I don't know if you followed what was going on. So that wave of migrants and refugees that happened in 2015 after was driven really by Russia's bombardment of cities. So they would deliberately hit hospitals, major utilities, civilians, essentially kill women, children, and everybody and civilians in these cities to make people flee. What that did was a couple of things. First, it made it easier for the Assad regime to control the country. When it's empty, it's easy to control it. Second thing, the migrant wave undermined Europe. Remember, Europe was putting Russia under sanctions at that time. And they just sent a flood of millions actually into Germany, into the European Union, creating the populist resentment. Actually, a lot of the populist rise in Europe has been because of the refugee wave, and Russia is turning it on and off. So now they have a blackmail mechanism against Europe, which was trying to contain Russia. So that's another reason. Third reason is they're demonstrating how you control a population, how do you control the Middle East? So they kind of demonstrate to the US that democracy promotion doesn't work. You actually need to support dictators like us and Assad to control a population. If you want to put down an end to the terror problem, you need a dictator like Assad who's not afraid to bomb his own people and kill them, actually. So it's kind of a very brutal message they're putting up there. So it's kind of a multifaceted, I mean, I just put three, this is even more complicated. But yeah, it's a brutal kind of response in many ways, and it's been working so far, unfortunately.
Professor, thank you so very much for trying to unwrap the enigma of Russia. This has been an absolutely extraordinary talk, very interesting and very, very informative. I would like to announce our speaker for next month. We'll have our monthly forum on Wednesday, April 14th at noon. Our speaker will be Mike Stake with the Ventana Wildlife Society in Monterey, and he's going to speak about a trial by fire, California condor recovery amid a turbulent year on the Central Coast, which is a complete opposite kind of discussion than today. And if anyone asks who Mike Stark is by saying who, that was him. He talked to us earlier last year about owls. So with that, again, I want to thank Professor Matovski for his fascinating discussion today about Russia. This is the first lecture of a full course, I think. But we thank you very much for the summary. With that, I'm going to stop the